Welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm Kathleen Walter. With us now on the phone is the president of the National Rifle Association, David Keene. And Mr. Keene, thanks so much for joining us today. It's good to have you with us.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you.
President Obama heads to Newtown, Connecticut next week after pressing for more gun regulations in Colorado. The president wants an assault weapons ban, a prohibition on high-capacity ammo magazines, and universal background checks. Now, yesterday, the president insisted that these background checks are for criminals and that they're not a gun registration system. What is the reality in your view?
The reality is that it is a gun registration system. His own Justice Department has said that there's no reason to do the background checks unless you can put together a gun registry, a national gun registry. Under today's laws, if a criminal, in fact, goes to Walmart, for example, to try and buy a firearm and is prohibited from doing so when he undergoes the background check, that name is kept so he can be prosecuted. This administration doesn't prosecute those people, but it is a felony for a criminal to attempt to buy a firearm, and they can be prosecuted for that. There was an argument in the United States Senate. Senator Manchin of West Virginia, Senator Coburn of Oklahoma had been working with Senator Schumer of New York on a national, what they called a universal background check system. Both senators withdrew from the negotiations because Senator Schumer insisted that there had to be a national gun registry. A national gun registry is illegal under current federal law. Most gun owners and people who studied it are against such a registry. There are a number of reasons why. For example, the NRA is against it. First of all, historically, if you're going to impose stricter gun regulations, including confiscation, you start with the registry. Both Andrew Cuomo in New York and Dianne Feinstein in California have in the past said that if we could just get a registry, we could then have what they call forced buybacks. In other words, I know you own this firearm. You're either going to sell it to the government at a price we set, or you're going to be a criminal. That's one of the dangers of a national gun registry. In addition to that, let's assume the government was never going to do that. Maybe if this was 1950, you could compile that registry, lock it in a vault, it would be safe. Today, you know, we can't keep our nuclear secrets safe. We had the situation in New York with sidearm licensees where a newspaper actually published the names and addresses of people who owned the firearms, creating all kinds of problems. Gawker, the website, has gotten hold of firearms ownership information and published it on the Internet. So there are a whole lot of reasons why this is a terrible idea and why we're so opposed to it.
White House officials concede that Harry Reid's new gun control legislation could die in Congress. Why do you think that is? And is the president losing on this issue?
Well, it's always hard to bet against an incumbent president if he's willing to use all of the power and the money at his disposal. If he opens up the Treasury and starts building dams and bridges and libraries, Lord knows how many votes he might get as a result of that. But the fact of the matter is, we've always believed that if you take the time, if senators and congressmen take the time to listen to their constituents and to really study the impact of some of these proposals, that much of what they thought they were going to pass won't pass. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is many of these things are basically what I call feel-good proposals. They won't do anything to either cut gun crime on the one hand or gun violence, as the president calls it, on the other. They won't prevent another Newtown. They won't prevent a criminal in Chicago from robbing a 7-Eleven. What they will do is put increased burdens on honest American gun owners who have every right under the Second Amendment to the Constitution to legitimately, privately own and use firearms.
The ambassador to the UN recently voted to approve an international treaty restricting the international trade of firearms. What is the NRA's position on this, and do you see it getting the 2/3 vote needed in the Senate for ratification?
I don't believe that the treaty will be ratified by the United States Senate. A number of Republican senators and at least one Democrat have already come out and said that they're against ratification. I was appointed to the UN Commission during its last series of negotiations leading up to this treaty. I was appointed by then-President Bush. And I can tell you that from the beginning, while the publicity talks about denying tanks and rocket launchers and all the rest to guerrilla groups and that around the world, what the UN is really after is the private ownership of firearms. And we had proposed, the United States had earlier proposed, we withdrew this under the Obama administration, that civilian ownership of firearms, sidearms and long arms, should be exempted from this treaty. The UN has on every occasion refused to do that, so that the treaty as it's written in its final version that's going to go to the president, who is going to sign it, would and could very easily affect the Second Amendment rights of the American people. Before the Obama administration came in, the U.S. had taken a very strong position that we would not participate in or countenance a treaty that did in fact require us to restrict the Second Amendment rights of our citizens. This treaty would do that. And in spite of the fact that the president and others say, oh, don't worry about it, I think a majority of senators are very worried.
So how will the NRA respond to this moving forward?
Well, we're opposed to it. We're going to work against it. We're going to try and rally both our members to contact members of the Senate, and we're going to work with the Senate itself. The president's got to get two-thirds of the Senate to approve this treaty. I don't think he's going to get that. This is going to be, however, a problem going into the future, just as the Kyoto Treaty was under the Clinton administration. You'll remember the Kyoto Treaty was the so-called anti-global warming treaty that Bill Clinton signed and then never submitted to the Senate because he knew it wouldn't be ratified. But he used it as an excuse to try through regulatory means and others to comply with some of its provisions. And that's what I think the Obama administration is going to do with this treaty. Although it won't be ratified, they'll say that they have an obligation to attempt to do domestically whatever they can to restrict gun rights and consistent with the treaty.
Let's turn to the states real quickly, Mr. Keene. Connecticut lawmakers recently approved a wide-ranging bill with sweeping new restrictions on weapons and large-capacity ammunition magazines. What do you make of this legislation, and are the states the next battleground in the war on guns?
Well, actually, the states are in many ways, a few of the states, I should say, not most of them, but a very few of the states are the real battleground for Second Amendment rights this year and on into the future. We think that in all likelihood, while there may be some things that we don't like that pass through Congress, that's not the real threat. The real threat are the kinds of things that have already happened in New York, happened this week in Connecticut, and are happening as we speak in Maryland. And these are things that are not being debated. For example, in the Connecticut situation, they invoked an emergency clause which allows the governor, without going through any committee of the legislature, without having any hearings, to put a package before the two houses of the legislature and demand a vote. In New York, Governor Cuomo put together a package in the dark of night, didn't have any hearings, didn't have any debate. Nobody had a chance to read it. They passed it. That legislation in New York, they've already had to go back 2 or 3 times to say, well, we're going to have to change it because it does things that just clearly we can't do. These are feel-good packages put together for either because of the emotion of the moment, or in the New York and Maryland cases because of governors who are trying to use them because they want to run in the Democratic Party for president and are trying to appeal to the most left-wing groups within that party for primary votes. That's a mistake from a policy standpoint. It's a strategic mistake from a political standpoint because they're doing what they accused Republicans last cycle of doing, remember, which was playing to voters for primary votes that would make them unelectable in a general election. That's what these two governors are doing. And in the process, without any consideration, they're not only burdening on the citizens, but they are crossing a constitutional line. These so-called assault weapons ban cover semi-automatic firearms that are widely owned in this country and commonly used for legitimate purposes. In the Heller decision, it was almost as if the majority of that court, predicting that this kind of thing would happen, talked about exactly what kinds of firearms you could and could not ban. And they said that a widely owned firearm in private hands is commonly used for legitimate purposes could not be banned. The AR-15, which is sort of the poster child for these folks, is owned by about 4.5 million private American citizens. It's the most used long arm in competition and long arm training. It's used for self-defense, for home defense, and for hunting. And it's almost as if the court said, you know, somebody's going to come along and try and ban this rifle, and we might as well address it now. I think that unless the Supreme Court is changed in some significant way, many of these laws, once they make it up there, are going to be struck down.
Mm-hmm. What about New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg? He's created a new organization called NRA'S Against Illegal Guns with a $12 million anti-gun advertising campaign. Do you think that he's helping or hurting the debate?
Well, he's being Michael Bloomberg. You know, it's interesting. The major media, if they find somebody contributing large amounts of money to conservative or Republican candidates or the like, get all outraged. And here's Michael Bloomberg, the mayor of New York, who has basically said, I will spend up to $1 billion if I have to go out and buy policy that I like on this. It's not enough to ban soft drinks. It's not enough to ban painkillers in New York's hospitals. He wants to go out and essentially repeal the Second Amendment, and he's spending money to do it. He's advertising now in states where Democratic senators in particular, who are up for election next time, are going to be crucial votes on these matters when they come before the Senate. You know, he has every right under the First Amendment to spend his money, but the fact of the matter is that a New York mayor like Michael Bloomberg, who's well known for wanting to regulate every aspect of citizens' lives, does not have the influence he thinks he has in some of these states, because the people in these states are smart enough to know exactly where this money's coming from and exactly what he's trying to accomplish.
Last question for you, Mr. Keene. What about the NRA's push to put armed guards in schools across the country? Former GOP Congressman Asa Hutchinson recently unveiled this. Some were skeptical when this idea was first introduced. Do you see this idea now gaining traction?
Well, it's gained a lot of traction since then. The report that Asa Hutchinson released earlier this week, and Asa is not just a former congressman, you know, he's former number 2 man at Homeland Security, he's former head of the Drug Enforcement Administration, and a former U.S. attorney. So he has a broad background in this kind of thing. In addition to that, the task force he put together included, among others, a former director of the United States Secret Service. And what they did was they asked the question that the Obama administration has been loath to ask, and that is not what do we do about guns, but what do we do to protect our children? And their conclusion was, based on the empirical evidence available over many years, is that armed security is a very effective part of any attempt to protect our children. 30,000 schools in this country out of 135,000 already have armed security. And so what they suggested is that every school district assess its needs, not just in terms of the need for armed guards or police presence or volunteer presence or whatever, but that we as a nation look at this, and if we're going to do it, and if schools want it, that we provide the training and the expertise so that we can, in fact, protect our children, for the simple reason that many of the people, most of the people, almost all of them who are involved in this kind of thing are not traditional criminals, but are people who are quite frankly insane. We can't screen all of those out of the general population. There are people like that, and one of the most effective ways to prevent them from doing what they do in their fantasies is to provide security. These people, as experience shows, are not wannabe warriors. They're wannabe mass murderers, and they look for unarmed places where they can go to accomplish their objective. Armed security prevents that.
All right, NRA President David Keene, thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.